So to begin, we have to first know like what can our tongue pick up and what our tongue can't. So the first thing would be we have bitterness, sweetness, which is what most of us like to go for when it comes to like a cup of coffee. We always talk about having a sweet coffee, how sweet it should be, things like that. And then we have saltiness. You do realize if you come across a very heavily fermented coffee, sometimes you do get saltiness, or when it's like under extracted. Very often people will be very surprised that you can taste saltiness in coffee. Yes, you can actually, but most of the time it's pretty mild. And we also have sourness, which is what most of us would refer to as acidity. And also we have umami. And another one that some people would always talk about is spicy or like spices. But do note that that actually is not a taste and that's not what your tongue would pick up, but more of like it's a sensation. A good example would be if you have some chili oil on your hands, and if you touch your eyes will start to feel burnt and spicy. So this says that it's more of like a sensation rather than a taste. Otherwise, you're telling me that your eyes could also taste coffee. So after we have understand like what our tongue can actually pick up, which is definitely something that everyone could easily do. The next thing to take it further would be to describe the intensity. What do I mean by intensity? Like for some coffee is always like super bitter, very bitter. So instead of using words like that, I would always suggest that we have this. You will have low, medium, and heavy or high. So with all this, then you will be able to identify and better describe on your coffee itself. So taking on this, we have to move on to what you will usually see on your coffee bag. They will talk about things like the flavor, the aftertaste, and acidity, things like that. So all this is actually in correlationship to time. And let me show you how it works. So as mentioned, for me, drinking coffee is always very much like a journey. From the very before you even put it into your mouth, time that where you swallow your coffee and you digest the flavors, it's a whole journey of like from the 0 second all the way to the X amount of seconds or like minutes depending on how long you take to enjoy. So one important word that we always come across is flavor. So what does flavor means? Very often we will see like flavors, acidity, bitterness, kind of descriptors on a coffee bag, and honestly, what does all those mean? So for flavor, let's zoom in and take a look at this right now. It's always a combination of what you experience on your tongue and in your nose as well. So earlier on, we talked about saltiness, bitterness, sweetness, sourness. All this is what we only experience on our tongue, especially if you realize when you are sick, you're having a running nose. A lot of things it's harder for you to pick up or to experience. So with that, we could actually infer our nose gives us a lot more or contribute a lot more in terms of the whole flavor experience that you will get in a coffee or in like your daily consumption of food or any other drinks. And with that in mind, we always want to look at in correlation to time. The moment you take your first sip, or right even before you take your first sip at the 0 second to the X amount of second, what do you actually experience? So flavor, it's always about a combination of what you experience in your nose as well as on your tongue. This would help you to gain a more fuller experience from your coffee itself, like from hot, warm to cold, how does it change, and etc. This flavor part is what most of the time you will see on the back. And then moving on to the next one, which is aftertaste. So what exactly is aftertaste? Actually, very often it refers to right after you take your first sip, you swallow your first coffee. What do you experience right after that? I would always say, pay attention to your nose. Once you swallow the first sip, give it a second or less than half a second, you will experience something in your nose. That's when the aroma volatiles travels right into your nose when you swallow it. This is what we call the aftertaste. It is very important for you to understand like what is flavor, what's aftertaste. This is because then it will help you to identify what exactly is the good thing or the cons of this coffee so that you can better calibrate your coffee. So I'll just write that down. So it will be in your nose. Of course, for aftertaste, sometimes we do experience some stuff on your tongue, right? Even right after you swallow, you will have what you experience, like example would be like dryness or like bitterness that still lingers on your tongue despite that you have already swallowed the coffee. So this is what we call the aftertaste. And the different part, once you are able to identify, you would know how you can change your coffee as accordingly. A good example would be flavor. It could taste like dark chocolate. So dark chocolate gives you like the flavor of a chocolate, how heavy it is, and it also can taste bitter. Then in the aftertaste, once you swallow or when you bite on a dark chocolate, you can get bitterness or dryness as well. Sometimes you might get like a little bit of like raw cereal note for the underdeveloped kind of chocolate as well. So this is how you would identify. And then moving on to the next one, which is my favorite that everyone likes to talk about, is actually acidity. Because in roasting, you will experience it will develop so many different types of acid, and also because of how you brew. So first thing first, we always talk about the intensity. You'll be low, medium, and high. And another thing for acidity, we'll talk about the different types of acids to be able to identify them. So how I do it actually, I will always Google or look up online, like for example, strawberry. What kind of acids does strawberry have? Strawberry have tartaric, citric, and a little bit of malic. And then your lemon and lime is always like your citric with hints of malic. I do memorize them as accordingly. So this helps me to better describe and pick them up. So you also has your lactic, things like that. And the types of acids in a coffee just go on and on and on. So the best way to always approach this is first identify the intensity and always try different types of fruits to be able to help you to pick up what's the citric, malic, and tartaric, and lactic. Okay, so we go example one by one. Citric is easy. It's your lemon, orange, lime. Malic is very often found in your green apple. Tartaric is like your peach, your grapes, your strawberries. And lactic, interestingly, it doesn't really taste sour, but it's more of like a mouthfeel. It's what you actually find in your milk beverage. And the other one that you will always come across is your acetic acid, which is actually vinegar, which can happen and be found in coffee as well. So this is how I would identify acidity in coffee itself. And more importantly, like I think one of the very common descriptor of like how people like to describe coffee is like, oh, this coffee is very complex. But honestly, what does complex actually means? So in our coffee terms or in the industry, when we say a coffee is very complex, we mean it as something very good and positive. That's one thing. And you can actually pick up different types of things or like different types of acids or flavors. It's more like you're having like a fruit basket, and at different stage, you will experience different stuff. But one thing we need to take note is for acidity and your body, they are usually easy to pick up when your coffee is like from hot to warm onwards. So just imagine when you eat your ice cream. When you just scoop the ice cream and you have it, it's like, it's really nice. You get the flavors that you want to. If you do realize sometimes you forgot, you let it melt and you eat it later, it becomes so sweet. So this is because in our tongue, in our mouth, when something is too hot or too cold, we are unable to pick up the exact intensity or like some of the flavors will be hindered. Which is why when you eat the ice cream on its own, it's fine. But when it melts, it's like super sweet and it's completely as if it's like two different things. So same things goes for acidity and body. They are easier to pick up when it's from like hot to warm. So I always pay attention when I take my first sip will be more on the flavor and the aftertaste, because they are already very easy to pick up when you take your first sip. And as it cools, then I'll look into the acidity and body, and I'll pay attention to how it transits. So always remember, if you feel that you're confused, always go by intensity first. Did it become heavier, lighter, and etc. So now let's dive a little bit deeper into body. So body actually goes into two parts. One is the weight, and two is the mouthfeel. So what do I mean by the weight? It's the same thing that we talked about earlier on. It's about how heavy or how light. My favorite example would be if you like to drink a boba tea with 0% sugar and 100% sugar. Or alternatively, you can think when you enjoy your coffee with no sugar, and if you add in like maybe say 50 or 100 ml of like sugar syrup, the weight that sits on your tongue is going to be completely different. So that's why we will always describe it as light, medium, or heavy. So this is the first part about body. I will always first identify what is the weight, because this is the easiest to pick up. Basically how heavy or how light it sits on your tongue. And the other one would be how does it make your tongue feel. A few words that you will always see on a coffee bag: silky, syrupy, juicy. So basically it's literally what it means, like how it makes your tongue feel. Like silky would be like your tea that slightly glides through, syrupy like your sugar syrup, and juice is literally like how your juice would taste like. So Body, to me, is the easiest to identify among everything. So with all this information like jump up together, it really tells us that it's so important to do the tasting of the coffee step by step. And then finally, let's do a revision. We have flavors, we have aftertaste, we have the acidity, we also have the body. As per what I mentioned earlier on, the most important thing that what I'm looking for is always the balance. So what do I mean by balance? It's a balance of all these factors and how they add up together. Just picture that like you have got very complex acidity. You got your citric, your malic like your lime, your lemon, your orange, very vibrant, high intensity, but your body, it's very thin. So example, we have a high acidity and then low in body. What's going to happen? This whole coffee is going to be thrown off balance and will not be enjoyable throughout the different temperature. And if there's an aftertaste that lingers, but it's unpleasant, then it will be a thing that will throw off balance as well. So it's important to know at which stage, to recap, it is very important to know at which stage what are we looking out for. So when it's hot, we will want to first evaluate the flavors and aftertaste first. And as it transits to the warm stage, and then eventually cool, this is when we want to evaluate the acidity and body, because remember that it's going to be hard for your tongue to pick up or your nose to pick up when something is too hot or too cold. And after everything is evaluated, it's always very easy for you to then look back into the balance. So that's how I will approach when it comes to coffee. And to make all this simpler, this is what I will always do. Going back to the graph that we did earlier on, so this is the X amount of seconds, it's the 0 seconds. Then you have low, medium, and high. So if you feel that it's very complicated and it's too tedious and you feel lost, this is the first graph that I'll always draw. A good example would be this is the just before you solo it until you solo and then as it goes on. So if you feel that whatever I've shared earlier on, it's a bit too much to follow, so many technical terms, flavors, aftertaste, things like that. So now let's go to the basic whereby we can all definitely pick up and taste for sure. That would be, we have a few components. You have your acidity, your bitterness, and sweetness. So if you are able to identify all these three, which we definitely, all of us can do for sure, you would know whether if this coffee is off balance or not. So for example, like I mentioned, we always talk about the different intensity, and from the first, just before you drink it to the last moment, we can go one by one. So I'll always start with acidity. I will always remember it as, your abs. Do you have abs? ABS. That's how I remember it. Easy. So the moment when I take my first sip, this coffee maybe has a pretty high, medium intensity when I drink. And it kind of like, it will drop as the time passes. So this is how it would be like. And if this coffee doesn't have any bitterness at the beginning, but then the bitterness kind of like spiked up. As you solo, the bitterness hits you. And the next one that I will pay attention to would be the sweetness. Maybe it starts off as medium and it kind of like fade off. So what I can infer from this graph is, I know this coffee is definitely off balance. As you can tell that like bitterness and sweetness and acidity, they are very far apart from each other. Meaning that this coffee will not cool well and will not taste well eventually. So this is how I would do my first step whenever I guide new baristas, because it's easy for you to identify acidity, bitterness, and sweetness. And from here, I would know that is this coffee under extracted, over extracted, or is this ideal? So it will depend on what kind of bitterness that we are experiencing here and what kind of acidity do I experience here, and which will go further in depth later on. But this would first help you to identify if this coffee needs to be fixed or not. For this part, say a good example would be if, let's say, the acidity is medium throughout and it kind of like goes to medium low. Your bitterness is like low and it stays throughout. And if your sweetness is more or less on the same level or not, it decreases. When they are not too far apart, you know this coffee is still considered a balanced cup. It's still not too far off. If any of this were to have a spike, for example, if let's say the acidity, it starts off at a very high point and stays throughout, maybe just a little bit, just a slight drop, you will know that this coffee is definitely too bright or too sour. And the bitterness is also low, sweetness is also low. So it's more about how you can play around with the graph to achieve. If let's say the acidity is always high, we know we have to do a certain calibration to bring down the amount of acids that you will experience. And that will bring us to the other chapter whereby for acidity, we always change our temperature and water allocation. And then if this coffee, it's really bitter and the bitters kind of like spike up as we solo, we will have to identify what kind of bitterness this is. And we will have to change things like, for example, grind size, the brew ratio, things like that. So therefore, it's very important to first know if you can allocate them like, how is it high, medium, low? And then with this graph, we can then apply it to the different variables to know what to fix. Because very often, I think what we experience is when it's bitter, when it's over extracted, we go coarser. But that's actually not the case all the time. It's more about understanding how each variable would impact which particular part of the coffee. Like going finer not necessarily means that you bring more bitterness. Sometimes you do bring more vibrant acidity and more sweetness into the cup. So yeah, this is how we will want to approach the coffee. And I think what we can do right now is we will brew a cup and we will draw a graph together. So as we were talking about like how we use these, everyone can pick up acidity, bitterness, and sweetness. So to put it into practice, let's do it together. So instead of brewing, we just focus solely for this chapter all about how we taste and evaluate the coffee. I've chosen 3 different coffees with 3 very different profiles. So what we're gonna do is I will taste together without looking at the descriptors, and we will look at the acidity, bitterness, and sweetness. So we don't focus too much as to whether this is over, under, or ideal, but we focus on how do you identify the different level of intensity and how would we draw this graph before we move into whether is it under or over. That's why we will be using a cupping method instead of brewing to make sure that everything is fair and square, just in case I'm a bad brewer. Okay, so now let me share with you what are the 3 different coffees that we have. So we have this coffee from Ethiopia, and from Prologue, we have a Colombia from Supreme Roastwork, as well as we have a Abu Panama from Homeground. So I'll be adding hot water and we will wait for it as accordingly, and then we'll taste together. So at any point of time, cupping is always a very good practice, especially when it comes to describing the intensity, because you get to have different coffees right in front of you, whereby you can now have a gauge. So how does like low, medium, high mean to someone in Singapore, someone in China, someone in Korea? It really depends on how much coffee you are exposed to, how often do you do discussion with the rest. So attending cupping sessions or like doing your own cupping with like few different coffees on the table with different roasters, that would help you to build up your understanding and to calibrate yourself to how to better describe the intensity. So now we're just waiting for the coffee to settle at 4 minutes, and then we will start to drink the coffee together. So now let's put whatever we have talked about earlier on into actual practice. So basically, this doesn't require you to know any coffee tasting wheel, any flavor descriptors, because we can all identify and understand what is acidity, bitterness, and sweetness. So let's go for the first one. So remember, it should always be a step-by-step profile. I will first look for acidity in sequence. So my first sip, regardless, even if the coffee is very bitter or very sweet, all I want to think about is acidity. We can drink as per normal. You don't have to slurp or anything. Just take it as how you would usually drink your coffee. Okay, so the moment when I take in this coffee, the acidity is actually quite low, but it kind of like peaked to like medium and it fades off again. So that's for this coffee. See, it's really easy, especially when you focus only on one component instead of like having all the information to flood on you, and you will get very lost and disturbed by like certain profiles or etc. So always remember, rule number 1, if you really want to learn how to assess your coffee, you got to be very disciplined, because very often what I notice in many different baristas or brewers, they tend to get complacent and they will skip steps. So always remember, do them step by step. So the next one that I'll be going for would be bitterness. So all I care about would be how bitter, or is there 0 bitterness. Okay, so for this one, the bitterness actually start off quite low, and I don't really get it until like I swallow it. Only when I'm swallow the liquid, then I start to get a bit of bitterness, that kind of like. And then the last one would be sweetness. I would say the coffee started off really sweet and it kind of like fade a little bit as we solo. So if you notice, like if I would care a lot only just about bitterness, and what's very prominent in this one is the lingering and the spike in bitterness, I might neglect the fact that actually this coffee is pretty sweet at the beginning and the acidity also actually spike only in the middle and falls as we solo. So these are things that we want to pay attention to, and they will help us to not only better evaluate, but to make better decision when it comes to the calibration of coffee. So you don't want to just pay attention to whatever that it's easy to pick up, but every single factor. And this can be done without any form of special training with any baristas or whatsoever. So now let's try with the second coffee. So same thing, we want to pay attention to only acidity. So this kind of starts, I would say, medium-low. It spiked a little bit and it kind of like just fade off to medium. So this would be our acidity. This is the Colombian coffee, this one right over here. And then let's go for bitterness. The bitterness is actually quite low, but it spikes up a little as we solo. So always remember that like this is before you solo, and as you drink, what's going on in your tongue before you solo and then after you solo. How did all this, the intensity fluctuate or go down and etc. Go up or go down. And the last one we want to look at is the sweetness. I would say this one, the sweetness is more like medium and it goes down. So if we were to compare what we have just now and what we have now, they are actually very different coffees. You could already tell that how should you approach this coffee when you want to brew, and we'll go more in depth later on. But let's do one more practice of the last coffee from a different origin. This one is from Ethiopia. This has pretty low acidity throughout. So as you can compare and you think about, if we were to think about the other graph, whereby there's a fluctuation in terms of intensity, whereas this one is pretty straightforward. But however, does not necessarily means that this is something negative. We have to also look at the bitterness and sweetness to know whether if this is a kind of cup profile that we want to go for. So now let's pay attention to the bitterness. Surprisingly, there's not much bitterness. In fact, I think you can start maybe here and goes just a little bit lower than the acidity. So from here, I could actually infer that for this coffee, especially to the last part, the acidity would be more pronounced than the bitterness. And now we'll go for sweetness. And this coffee is actually pretty sweet, but it fades off very quickly. So from this graph and the previous graph, what we could tell that is the first two coffee is a lot louder in terms of the cup profile. A lot of things, it's more pronounced, the acidity, the bitterness, whereas this will be more toned down as compared to the first two. So from this, we can already evaluate there are three very different coffees. And for this particular coffee, if you were only to pay attention to acidity and neglecting the fact about the sweetness and bitterness, we will not be able to fix the problem. We will just be thinking about, okay, I need to make my acidity more vibrant. But you might neglect the fact that actually the sweetness is also degrading as you drink it and as you enjoy it. So what are the steps that we can do to both bring down the acidity to make it more vibrant and lively? At the same time, how do we increase the sweetness? Because we do want to keep the bitterness as low as we can throughout the cup. So this is how we will approach. So do remember, as I always emphasize, start from acidity, bitterness, and sweetness. And with these, if you are disciplined enough, these would help you to make better decision. So what we're gonna do next is we will be brewing one coffee, and then I'll draw a graph, and then based on whatever we have, I'll make the necessary adjustment to fit to the next graph that what I believe would be ideal for that cup. Okay, so we'll be brewing the first coffee and we will evaluate it together. So to make it simple, I will always use my default recipe for a coffee that I have not brewed before. This one I'll be splitting into 4 different pours. The first pour will be 60 grams. And I will end my second pour once I hit 130 grams. So in one of the chapters that we'll cover later on, it's about how you build your default recipe as well. So we'll go more in depth into that later on, as well as how do you make use of all the information that you have on the coffee bag to use to kickstart with the correct brewing temperature. But for now, let's just focus on how do we evaluate. And for my next pour, I'll be ending at 185 grams of water. Today we are using 15 grams of coffee. And we'll end it off at 225 grams, which is a 1:15 ratio. Let's get a cup and we will taste together. And remember, one of the things that I mentioned earlier on is at the beginning, we should always use the same cup for your evaluation. So to make sure that we don't introduce any additional variable and we focus on just the acidity, bitterness, and sweetness. Let me get a cup. And if you want to choose like what kind of cups for your default cup, I always recommend something really neutral that does not have any fancy shapes or colors to it. White would always be the best because it's the most neutral color that we can find. Another very important note, do remember that every time when you evaluate your coffee, you should always have the same amount of coffee when you want to evaluate it. We shouldn't be having coffee that's only like half filled, semi-filled, 1/3 filled or what. So always make sure that you keep to the same. If you decide that like half filled is the best for you, do the same. Practice it until you're very confident, then you can go with the various amount. Because what happens is, when you have just a little bit of liquid in your cup, you realize that our head will have to tilt a lot more towards the back and the liquid will hit the back of your tongue first before it hit other parts. However, if your cup is filled to the brim or close to the brim, your head will just be really close and you just have to tilt just a little bit for the liquid to flow onto your tongue. So it is very important to make sure that every time the amount of liquid you have or coffee you have in your cup is always the same. So I've took my first sip. The first thing that we should be paying attention to is actually, remember, is the acidity. So for this one, the acidity starts off at medium and it kind of like spiked and went up. And the next thing would be bitterness. The bitterness, I would say, it's quite high at medium and it kind of like drop a little bit as we swallow it. So as you get better and more, you do it with more practice, you can actually evaluate all the 3 different components at one go. But I would still recommend you to do one by one. And the last one would be the sweetness. For this one, I would say the sweetness is actually quite low. I don't really get too much of it. So in this graph, we could clearly tell that like this coffee is definitely off balance. It's not what I will perceive as a good cup. First thing first, the acidity is way too high and the bitterness kind of like go along, and although it did degrade a little bit after that, but there's not much sweetness to support this whole cup. So what you will only taste is just a lot of acidity and you won't probably enjoy it as it goes. So what I will do, my goal, if I were to just picture it without any calibration or whatsoever, I want to make sure that my acidity either stays throughout or it mellows down a little bit or it goes up just by a little bit. So I do not want to have the acidity to go all the way up as we swallow because it's not going to be pleasant as it dominates the other profile. And one thing that I need to know is I need to increase my sweetness. So sweetness is very low. I would either want it to start off either low or like medium low, so it can match up with the acidity. So why sometimes we enjoy lemonade, why we enjoy iced lemon tea, it's because there's enough sweetness in the cup to support the vibrancy and the acidity in the drink itself. That's why it's very enjoyable as a lemonade or like an iced lemon tea or like your fruit juice. So sweetness will go very well with acidity. So it's important to have these two to work very closely with each other and they should not be very far apart. And in this case, it's very far apart. And for me, I feel that the bitterness is not something that bothers me so much. The bitterness kind of like stay through and it will drop a little bit at the finish, which I still think that it's not so bad. So I will want to focus more on the acidity and sweetness. So this is how I picture like this coffee, how I want it to be. So the next thing that I will want to ask myself is, how can I bring down the acidity and increase the sweetness? So this will go to the part where we talk about what are the different variables that we have as a brewer. How can we make changes to change this as accordingly? So this will be what we will cover at a later chapter as to which variable will influence what kind of flavors. So remember, first thing first, let's do a quick recap. We taste every single sip that we take. We focus only on just one we draw the graph, and once we are done, we want to then think about what is our goal. So if we are just blindly calibrating, okay, this is under, I want to make sure that I increase my extraction to reach ideal, that's not good enough. That's not going to get you anywhere close to what you will want to have. So it's important to know what do you want to achieve, and from there on, we make the changes as accordingly to hit this so-called the ideal graph. So that's how I always calibrate my coffee, including for like compulsory coffee in our competition. This includes coffee that I've never brewed before, different roast level. It works for all sorts and any sorts of coffee. So this would be a very systematic approach, but only if you follow through and be very disciplined to focus only on one spectrum every time when you taste your coffee. And with this, I'm going to move on and bring us up to the tasting wheel that you always get to see in every single website or like coffee shops, things like that. When we start to get more complicated, we will see notes of like pomegranate, leather, vegetable, and etc. And how does all those mean, and why is tasting wheel important? This is good enough for you to calibrate your coffee, but the next very important thing we want to do here is to be able to communicate with your peers, your baristas, your roasters, your friends, or your customers. So that's when we need to improve in our description. So let's move on to that. Right, and we talk about how important it is to communicate with your baristas, your roasters, your customers, anyone that you wish to talk coffee to, because talking bitterness, sweetness, and acidity sometimes can be a bit boring. So you want it to be a bit more descriptive. Therefore, we have things like what you see online on every different website, that what we call the coffee tasting wheel. And I think there is two that I always fall back to, which I believe will be very useful for you. And let's go with the first one. The first one is actually the counterculture tasting wheel that I always use, especially for the part about the body. Remember, initially we talked about how important it is to identify the intensity of like light, medium, and heavy. And if you were to pay attention for the counterculture, under the light session, they actually describe about what are the words that we usually use to describe a light body coffee, like tea light, silky, juicy, things like that, or even like watery. And whereas for something that is like heavy, we have like mouth coating, we have velvety, we have full, and then in medium, we have like syrupy, round, creamy. So what I always do is I will first identify the intensity, and then I will then look into the mouthfeel, which is basically how it makes your tongue feel like. Is it like silky, syrupy, juicy, things like that. So just imagine, a coffee wouldn't taste heavy if it gives you a watery kind of like tactile. So vice versa, it will not have this mouth coating kind of texture if it's a very light body coffee. So this is how you want to put these two things together to better help you to describe your coffee experience. So my favorite when it comes to description of like about body, I always use the counterculture tasting wheel, especially this part. And the other one that we always look at would be, for me, is the SCA coffee wheel. This is the one that we always use for under any scenario, we will have this. So this is probably what you always see with mainly when you attend any SCA classes, level 1, level 2, things like that. So there's actually a way as to how you can use this. We always start from the most inner circle and we move outwards. One of the way that some people like to describe their coffee would be using colors, which is why you will see a lot of different various colors on a tasting wheel. Just one example, if you want to look at, if you feel that this coffee is very fruity, we can then zoom into fruity and you will see under the fruity branch, you will have like your berry notes, your dry fruits, your citrus fruits, things like that. So the other wheel that I really like to use under all types of scenario would be the SCA tasting wheel, which is probably also the one that you will see when you attend any SCA classes or when you go to a lot of coffee events or even coffee shop. So how to use this? There's actually a way. You always start from the inside and move outwards. Okay, one of the way that many people like to do is to associate what they taste to colors. However, it does not work for everyone, but that is definitely one of the ways. And if you feel that that's not how you want to do it, you can always start from the inner side of the circle, where you will see you have got your fruity, floral, sweet, nutty, chocolatey. So depending on what is the big branch that you have taste or experience, and then we will move outwards to the next tier whereby you have, for example, under the fruity section, you'll have your berries, your dried fruits, your citrus fruits. And do note that, like, for example, would be lemon. Another good example would be under your lemon and lime. You realize that lemon and lime, there is no gap in between it. This is because these two fruits, they are very close to each other. The taste profile, it's very similar. Whereas, between orange and lemon, you see this small little gap over here. So this means that although they belong to the same family of citrus fruits, but they are still two fruits that will taste very different from each other. So you can see, like, for example, you also have like under your berries family, you have your blackberry, raspberry, and then there's a little gap here in between raspberry and blueberry, and then you have strawberry. So it's always about getting the bigger picture first, and we slowly narrow it down. I would think it more like a pyramid. From the bottom, we build the base. The fruits is definitely a fruity note. Okay, then what kind of fruits? Is it berry, citrus, other kind of fruits like your grapes? And then you move on to, like, okay, if it's a grape, is it a white grape, green grape, Kyoho grape, red grape, black grapes? So because there are so many different varieties, it is always good to be as detailed as possible. But in the beginning, we can always just start with the most basic, which is your fruity, chocolatey, or nutty. Then we will move on, like, up the pyramid to get as detailed as we can. Why is detailed information so important? This is because you can then create a better customer experience for your guests, because it makes it even easier for them to identify. Because from grapes, different types of grapes, different types of strawberries, they will taste so different. So to start, always look at the tasting wheel. From the inside, we move outwards. This will not tell you whether the coffee is under, ideal, or over. It's more of like describing the entire experience instead. So yes, let's move on to the next part, which we briefly mentioned about earlier on, is the drinkware. How does one coffee changes accordingly to the different cup colors, the different cup shapes, and also the amount of coffee that will sit inside.